Welcome. I'm Ann Sterling, your host for Director's Cut New Mexico. The interview is one of the documentary filmmaker's most powerful tools. In this segment of Director's Cut, we'll explore the challenges of conducting an interview for documentary storytelling. Next, you will meet New Mexico filmmakers Dale Kruzik, R.C. Chapa, Christopher Schuler, Michael Kamens, and Beverly Singer. Join me now as our guests, all successful New Mexico documentary filmmakers, share their thoughts, insights, and strategies on the art of the interview.
Pre-production, 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 pre-production.
If you only had 3 people who could be in this documentary, who would you say should be there?
Without the good interview, you don't have a film.
Asking the right questions, but how do you learn to ask the right questions?
The art of the interview is the art of listening.
In the early development of a documentary, a great deal of time is spent searching for information and resources in support of the story.
Interviewing people really, it comes from this sense of actually having done some sort of pre-research, knowing a little bit about the subject or the person, or, reading up on whatever it is you're interested in. It's much like writing a paper. And I still do that. I remember the first time that I created a documentary in 1979. I wrote a whole thesis, basically, on the subject I was looking at. And partly that was because I wanted to ask the right questions to people and not sound as if though I didn't have any sense as to what I was going into.
I try to research a topic as thoroughly as humanly possible within the time given, and I usually use pre-production for a year and a half, researching as much as I can, and meeting with as many different people from as many different sides of this topic as I possibly can. One of the questions we ask is, who should be, if you only had 3 people who could be in this documentary, who would you say should be there? And I start a production book that is this thick before I ever think about deciding who I'm going to interview. And then we go out and we do the interviews and all those things. But I really keep in mind all that research. So I become not an expert, but certainly a very knowledgeable person about the topic.
I think that you can get to the truth, and that's always been what drives me. And so I've never had an issue with, am I presenting the right people here? Because my research and development, and mostly my research, really gets at the core of the story. Research and development is a lot easier now than it used to be. Before, it required a lot of phone calling and hoping that somebody can lead you in the right direction. And with the web, you can just Google any name and you can get all kinds of information. It's like getting a master's done on the web.
I think people have to remember you don't have to spend a huge amount of time developing the treatment or researching. Sometimes you just have to do it pretty quickly, and it's part of the business. For a lot of independent filmmakers, I think you end up doing a lot more research because part of that involves waiting for the funding. You have to develop it, and you put your proposal out there, and you make your contacts, and you keep working at it, and that could take years.
Pre-production, 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 pre-production. I just can't say it enough, and it sounds like a broken record, but you live and die by pre-production. And I say that because I've spent too many hours in the edit room, and I've realized that I don't really want to spend that much time there trying to make things work. It's too expensive, it beats up your brain, you lose your creative edge, you start swimming in the material, and it hurts. And so I really like the fact that when I'm ready to go out in the field, I know who my people are, what I want to do with them, where they're going to stand, how I'm going to use them, what they're going to talk about. I really like to go after specific things because I've got it figured out ahead of time. Now, that's burned me really bad because I've gone in there and sat down in an interview and gone, I know what I'm getting here. And then I sit there and go, okay, this isn't working. And then you have to be able to switch up. And sometimes the best stuff happens when you least expect it. So I've learned also that as much preparation you can do, you have to leave that window open for spontaneity and discovery.
And during the research process, you may hear interesting stories that help to develop material to explore with other guests.
The art of the interview is really the art of listening. And I think when people realize that you're there to get their story, that you're not there to show them how much you know about the subject, they generally feel like you're there, you're being sincere. One of the things I try to avoid is referring too much to my notes. I think that can make somebody who's not used to being on camera a little bit concerned that maybe they're not interesting and you're looking away, you're not engaged. Yeah, you know. So Dale, you know, you certainly want to get your questions answered. You don't want to, you know, have them go on for hours, but you also want to make sure that they feel comfortable enough to tell you their story and not hold back.
I had this thought, you know, saying, oh, he's going to be my father for the rest of my life.
What do you say, Moot?
I was producing a short 10-minute documentary promoting the documentary of another filmmaker. When I was working for PBS, I was asked to promote this documentary that was going to be a big deal for the station. So they said, why don't you do a little piece on the film and the making of the film for its promotion on my weekly show. The filmmaker had done a documentary about how this utopian community formed back in the early 1900s. Well, she gave me a little idea of who I should talk to, and she told me, but don't interview this 95-year-old woman because she's mean and she'll snap at you. But when I went to the community, people told me, she's a must. I have to interview her because she's pretty much the last living person there who can actually talk from first-hand experience. So I went and interviewed her. We got to talking, and I couldn't understand what this other filmmaker was talking about because she was extremely friendly. She took me around her house. She took me to all her photo albums, and I decided on the spot that the best way to get her to express herself and to hear the stories of life in this utopian community in the early 1900s was for us to sit next to each other with a photo album where she could look and tell me everything instead of trying to recall everything. So we went picture by picture, and we got the most incredible interview. And her story was so moving, and her comparison of life today and life in this utopian community and just her own politics, they all came out with just us looking at these pictures. And I think that's the key, is really getting people to talk, because if you can't get people to say what's important and what's in their heart, then you're not going to have a story.
I'm always looking for those, actually, those moments when it was like an unscripted moment or someone just walked in, and that happens a lot. I was working on a project called Hojo of Native Women, and in that particular project, it was a number of leaders, Native women leaders in their community, were working on health issues. And it was so interesting because one of the women that I really, really wanted to interview, she sang. She was a healer through singing, and she agreed to be interviewed. And unfortunately, when we did the interview, it was like it wasn't meant to be. But while we were interviewing her, this other woman kind of came up, and it turned out that she was the woman we were supposed to interview. And so she told us the entire story of Sweat Lodge for Native women, and went through the cycles of the moon with women and the connection with Native women. It was powerful, and I just thought, that's why.
What is one of the filmmaker's most carefully cultivated resources? It's people. Experts who can speak about the subject with authority, eyewitnesses, or those people who can give personal testimony.
I just try to get the players who are involved in whatever story it is that I'm doing, who are the leaders in the story. For example, the story about the African American community that was trying to fight this big mega corporation. It's very obvious that I'm talking to the corporation president, that I'm talking to the woman who is the head of the advocacy group for the community, because she's extremely knowledgeable. It's not difficult to see that these are truly the people who are involved with the story. They're the ones who know the facts. I interview people over the phone until I know I've talked to the right people, and I know I've talked to the right person when that person is impassioned and is articulate and can tell the story that I'm looking for in a passionate way. If there's no passion, If people aren't into the story that I'm trying to tell, then it's going to be hard for me to convey that story.
Because of the way that we do our documentaries, the interview becomes a crucial, if not the crucial, part of the entire documentary process. But I think it's important to let the people tell the story. So then it becomes even more important, who are you going to have on camera and why? How do we tell that story in an action-oriented way with critically passionate people about the topic and in a documentary form where I can't set up cameras and lights and all this stuff all the time. We have to go in and find a way to make that happen without inserting ourselves into it. So it gets very tricky. So finding the right person, as you mentioned, is in fact the critical element first. And that person has to be able to deliver to me those elements that I want after all this research that we talked about. So that person has to either be an expert on the topic with information that I'm going to need to put in and that's going to guide us through. That person has to be affected by the topic in some fashion. And most critical, and this is a horrible thing to say, but it's the way of the world, this person has to be able to talk. And you know how many people don't talk. I mean, and especially talk with all this gobbledygook around.
A lot of the work I do, it's already known as far as who the main characters are, and you get their permission and you let them know that you want to do this program.
It's the place where most of America calls home. America's first people have been migrating here in large numbers for more than a century.
Some of it is pre-production, and actually some of it is during the process of shooting. You know, you might see somebody's family member that you think, wow, you know, I think they would be a really good part of this story. So you interview them. You just have to feel that out, you know. It's just part of the process. You might walk away from an interview and say, I got everything I need. You know, this is great. Or you might want to go back to the same person, you know, like you interview them at the front end of the story. And you say, I'm going to come back to this person, you know, halfway through the project and see what I can get that I perhaps missed, you know, during the first interviews.
I don't know I found the right person until I've got them in front of the camera and I get done with the interview. I talked about pre-production. I think that's really important, and I do pre-interviews, but I try to hold back on that so I don't get to all the good stuff until the camera's on. Mm-hmm. But then when the camera's on, it's a whole different game. And people sit there and go, oh, right? And it totally blows everything out of the water. I may have had this great conversation with John Nichols prior to the camera being on. And then you turn the camera on and it just goes away, and then you spend your entire time trying to dig out this little bit of a bite that you can use because you want to save the afternoon because you just drove to Taos.
I worked on this amazing project in various parts of the Americas. It was a project for the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, and we were to look at indigenous peoples, their lives, their current kind of political positions and what have you. We were to look at traditional ways, and what I found out was that the people who were the most interesting to work with were those people who really had a knowledge base. It's like they really knew what they were talking about. They had lived and experienced and transitioned. I mean, we worked with whalers, you know, and the stories they tell you about whaling were amazing, you know, and they were just like, you just knew, you know, that was the right thing to do. Even though I'd done research, it was nothing like what I'd read, you know, and they could just like sort of take you by the hand and say it was like this. It could run it through completely, you know, the whole whaling event. And I love that, you know, was to learn it kind of firsthand from someone. And then they took us out and we went whaling with them, you know, and that sort of experience is always the best, you know, is that someone does know really deep down inside of themselves what it is they're talking about.
The Inupiaq's belief is that you don't go to the whale comes to you, to be given to you.
The filmmaker's decision of who to interview, what questions to ask, and how to go about asking them set the stage for the story.
Everyone's different. Everyone's a challenge. Everybody has a good day and a bad day. I think the real art of doing documentaries is engaging with that person and getting them to relax and open up their heart or their minds or their souls or all those things we really, really love when we see in documentaries.
You close your eye and take on that.
Nope, my dear Luther. Don't go away from me, Luther.
I won't.
There's nothing in the world that I have except you.
I think the most important thing is that you're really interested in what they're doing and that you have a clear sense of what you want to get from them too. Because I've been in interviews where I've beat people up. I've sat there and I just keep going after the same thing over and over and over, and I'm thinking, oh God, you know, if I don't get that, it's not going to work. And they sense that. They're trying really hard, and you know, after a while you're just kind of exhausted and you kind of lose the spontaneity and the freshness. So I think I try to come in, a little bit of light chit chat, show that I'm interested and say, look, I really want to know about this. I think this is really interesting. Tell me about it. What's your favorite color? I'm serious.
The parents we interviewed for some of these, the youth suicide thing as an example. I mean, I talked to them more ahead of time, not about what I was going to ask them, but about why I was doing the program. Mm-hmm. And my job as a producer then is to, leading up to the interview, make them feel comfortable with me, that I am going to be honest with them, that I am going to not make them look a way they don't want to look. And I think that's important. And that way, if they're comfortable with me and they trust me, if the trust is there, then they'll go places with me on camera that maybe they wouldn't normally go. Mm-hmm. We found that true. We did a show called One Friday Night on underage drinking. This centered around a 13-year-old girl who went to her first slumber party. Parents did everything right. These are involved parents. Went to her first slumber party. Some guy snuck in a bottle of vodka. The girl drank it. Alcohol poisoning, died the next morning. Now, I spent a lot of time with that family before they ever agreed to go on camera. And part of what I did was, I said, listen, I don't know, number one, if we want you on camera. I don't know if you want to go on camera, but let's set that aside. As a producer of this thing to try to help young people and parents, I need to know what happened and why, so that I can more fully do an honest, accurate job of this program, and I need to pick your brain for that. Would you let me do that? You know, we decided together, yeah, this is something that would be good. I said, I think it would be something. What do you think? And they said, yeah, I think it would be good. It's going to be very difficult. And I said, I know it is, and I'll try to make it as easy as possible if you want to go there. And they said, let's do this. And then we went there, and it turned out to be fabulous. It won 5 Emmys. I mean, it was a big league show, but the whole show rested, it wasn't on me, it was on them being willing to do this. And I think they felt very good about the program after it aired and what it did. And that made me feel good.
Some interviews are for discovery, but whether or not the interview actually makes it into the film, it needs the same preparation and planning.
We talk a lot before we actually sit down and do the interview, and I try not to be too formal. The setting here would, I think, frighten someone, you know, quiet on the set, you know, all of the things that happened prior to this interview. But I try not to make it so formal so that people don't get frightened by the process. I let them get comfortable with me. I let them know about me, tell them basically what it is that I want from them, and try to tell them as much, because sometimes I don't have all the questions prepared myself. I have a general idea of what I want to ask, but that person may send me in a totally different direction, something that I hadn't expected, and that's part of the research, is that you come prepared and with research about that person, and so that you don't miss anything, but you have to be open to where the interview may lead you, because they may take you in a totally different direction.
Asking the right questions, but how do you learn to ask the right questions? I started out asking people all sorts of questions. I used to ask why questions. It's seldom that I ask, you know, why anymore, because that ultimately is what happens. I mean, at the end is you do come up with all sorts of whys. So I think timing, you know, knowing when to schedule your interviews, knowing where to hold interviews, how to really create an environment, you know, that gives you, you know, and the person you're interviewing, or the community or whatever, it's moments. They need to breathe. They need to be able to take the time they need to share.
First of all, I prepare extensively. I was on location, as I said, last week doing some interviews, and we had a couple interns with us. And they said, wow, you interview really well, which made me feel good. But I said, why do you say that? And they said, well, you just seem to know the right questions and stuff, and you just kind of know them. Do you just kind of wing it? And because it looks like that, because I don't have my questions in front of me. And I said, first understand, I've studied this for a year and a half. So I had my questions. I mean, everything's up here, and I know this person very, very well. I mean, if they say that didn't really happen that way, or if they say, no, I've never experienced that, I'll say, but what about when this happened? Oh, yeah. And I mean, I think they're maybe they forgot or something, but I know. So my preparation for interviews, I like to think, that's where I can really earn my money.
Usually all my interview setups have been by phone. Usually it's like, okay, this is what's going to happen and when is the best time for you. I usually let them decide what is the best date or the time or a setting, and then I'll work around that. Because once in a while I will have to use a studio, and I've done that, and usually I still try to work with people's schedules. I'm very, very flexible. I think flexibility is a key. On some levels, and other times, it's just depends. A lot of it depends on the availability of the people you're working with as well. And if you're out in the field and you absolutely must get an interview, and your journalistic mode comes into sort of play, and you're just frustrated and you're not getting any cooperation or whatever. Usually, what I've had to do is just pack up and just say, oh, well, was it meant to be? And I can do that now. I can just walk away from something. I don't have to have it, because I know that, it's gonna manifest itself in another form through someone else.
The place will certainly affect the tone of the interview for sure. I like being at home, I like to be in a comfortable place, or I like to be with John Nichols out on the mesa walking along, because he turns into a 16-year-old when he's running down the trails into the gorge. Yeah, I mean, that's all part of it. But I think the other thing to consider is that I really want these things to have a look. I mean, it's gotta look right. And so my interviews are hopefully as photographic as the actual photographic cover, and that they interweave so nicely that you've got a great visual look overall. So it just isn't somebody sitting in a room and then suddenly you go out and have this great landscape. I mean, I really want to make sure that both of those elements combine nicely and create an overall visual impact.
What setting do we put them in that'll be honest and accurate and show them for what they really are? Where can we put them so it's quiet, so that we can hear them, so there's not cars, all that gobbledygook technical stuff. And then how can I make them most comfortable? How am I going to get them to deliver in the best way they can, given that circumstance? That may be a coffee shop. That may be their home. That may be an office. But all those decisions go into, and are crucial, I think, to delivering a good interview. One of our shows, we did all the interviews in public areas. And the reason we did that was to show that you can talk about this issue, mental health issues, anywhere, anytime, any place. It can be any place. It's where that person's going to feel most confident. And it's where that person is going to appear the way that you want them to appear. Every choice you don't make is a choice you do make. You decided to do this here. I don't know why, but it's a choice. It's making me look a certain way. They messed with the candle light to make it look a certain way. The director knows why. They wanted to make me look like I'm intelligent. Bad move. Every choice you do and don't make is in fact a choice. Even as a documentary in pure simple form is turn on the camera and let it watch something. You're documenting something. Honestly, you're not influencing it. Well, listen, by the camera being there, you're influencing the situation. But, all those things make a difference. So you better think about them as an interviewer or as a producer, because they're all going to have something to do. And I don't think that's dishonest. I think it's really thinking it through and making it as honest as you can.
I make my decision based on what's going to make that person the most comfortable. If they're not comfortable, you're not going to get a good interview. I recently did a documentary on Poncho Sanchez, and I interviewed him first here in New Mexico. I interviewed him at UNM at a setting that was totally foreign to him. He wasn't comfortable. He didn't really know me that well. And so the interview was very stiff. He had very short 2-3 word answers. He was irritated and just very anxious to end the interview. I knew that that interview was a bust. So once he came on board with the idea that we were doing the documentary, we decided on doing the interview at his home and in his favorite room in his house, where his backdrop were all his favorite CDs and all his favorite music, and with Tukonga sitting in front of him. So he was very comfortable. He opened up. We were able to do an interview for 2 hours. And he was able to tell me things that he would never have the first time around, just about losing his musical father, and he almost got emotional. So to me, when somebody can get to the heart of a story or to the heart of their issue and almost get emotional themselves, and I feel like I've been successful at a good interview.
We have covered many topics, from the art of listening to how a guest is prepared for the interview. As you've seen, there's more than one approach. What we can agree on is that each of our generous guests has his or her own unique way of achieving their desired results. What they do have in common is dedication to hard work and a feeling that they can make a difference. For Directors Cut New Mexico, I'm independent filmmaker Ann Sterling.